In a luxurious first-class cabin, a powerful black man's calm is tested by a model's vicious prejudice until his shocking identity flips the script. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell to catch our latest stories. Don't miss the drama unfolding at 35,000 feet. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 hummed with the quiet luxury of privilege. Its plush leather seats and polished wood accents bathed in soft amber light. But the air crackled with tension as Malcolm Carter, a middle-aged man of African descent, settled into seat 2A. His worn corduroy jacket, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and scuffed loafers stood in stark contrast to the opulence around him, drawing the immediate disdain of his seatmate. Isabella Vaughn, a 26-year-old white fashion model whose face graced billboards for a high-end Parisian brand. Isabella, draped in a fur coat that cost more than most people's cars, her low-cut scarlet dress clinging to every curve, clutched a $10,000 handbag and shot Malcolm a look of unfiltered contempt, her lips curling as if his very presence offended her senses. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his dark eyes calm but sharp, and offered a polite nod, only to be met with a scoff. "You must be lost," she hissed, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "This is first class, not the bus station." Malcolm's lips twitched into a faint smile, his deep voice steady as he replied, "I'm quite comfortable here, ma'am, but thank you for your concern." The words, laced with a quiet dignity, only fueled Isabella's rage. She leaned closer, her perfume sharp and expensive, and spat. "People like you don't belong here. Did you sneak in? Or is this some kind of charity ticket?" Her words dripped with venom, each syllable a calculated jab at his race, his appearance, his audacity to exist in her world. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some averted their eyes, others whispered, and a few nodded in silent agreement with Isabella's outburst. A silver-haired man in a tailored suit across the aisle muttered, "Standards are slipping these days." Malcolm, unfazed, folded his hands in his lap, his calloused fingers tracing the edge of an old leather watch, its understated elegance unnoticed by the others. "I assure you I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," he said, his tone so measured it seemed to mock her fury. Isabella's face flushed crimson, and she jabbed a manicured finger toward him, her voice rising to a near shriek. "This is unacceptable. I paid for exclusivity, not to sit next to this." The word hung in the air, unspoken but clear, a racial slur cloaked in her pause. A flight attendant, a young woman with a nervous smile, hurried over, her badge glinting under the cabin lights. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" she asked, glancing between Isabella and Malcolm. "Yes, there's a problem," Isabella snapped, tossing her blonde hair. "This man is in the wrong cabin. Do your job and move him." The attendant hesitated, her eyes flickering to Malcolm, who raised a hand gently. "No trouble here," he said, his voice like a calm tide. "I have my boarding pass if you'd like to check it." The attendant nodded, clearly relieved, but Isabella wasn't done. "This is outrageous. I'll have your job for this," she barked at the attendant, then turned back to Malcolm. "You think you can just sit there and ruin my flight? I know people, important people." Malcolm tilted his head, his expression almost amused. "I'm sure you do," he said softly, "but perhaps we could all enjoy the flight if we showed a little courtesy." The words stung Isabella like a slap, and she recoiled, her eyes blazing with a mix of shock and indignation. The cabin grew quieter, the other passengers now openly watching, some with disapproval aimed at Malcolm, others with curiosity. A woman in a pearl necklace leaned toward her husband, whispering, "He's awfully calm for someone in the wrong." But Malcolm wasn't in the wrong, and he knew it. He leaned back in his seat, the leather creaking softly, and gazed out the window as the plane began its taxi to the runway. The skyline of New York City blurred past, a reminder of the world he'd navigated for decades, a world that judged him by his skin before his character. Isabella, undeterred, pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she typed furiously. likely complaining to her followers or her agent. "This is going viral," she muttered, loud enough for Malcolm to hear. "You'll regret this." He didn't respond, but his silence was louder than her threats. The plane lifted off, climbing into the evening sky, and the cabin settled into an uneasy truce, punctuated by Isabella's occasional huffs and glares. Malcolm opened a worn paperback. Its pages yellowed from years of handling, and began to read, his focus unshaken by the hostility beside him. The attendant returned, offering Isabella a glass of champagne, which she snatched without a thank you. "You should be serving me, not him," she said, jerking her head toward Malcolm. The attendant forced a smile and offered Malcolm a drink as well. "Just water, please," he said, his voice warm, almost fatherly. The small gesture seemed to infuriate Isabella further, as if his politeness was a personal affront. She leaned toward him again, her voice low but venomous. "You're not fooling anyone," she said. "I've seen your kind before. You think you can act civilized and fit in, but you don't. You never will." Malcolm closed his book, his eyes meeting hers for the first time, steady and unflinching. "I've spent my life proving otherwise," he said, each word deliberate. "And I don't need your approval to do it." The weight of his words hung between them, a challenge wrapped in civility, and for a moment Isabella faltered, her bravado cracking under the intensity of his gaze. But she recovered quickly, tossing her hair and turning away, her fingers tightening around her handbag. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane reached cruising altitude, casting shadows over the faces of the passengers, each one a witness to a drama that was only beginning. Malcolm's calm, his refusal to bend under Isabella's onslaught, was a quiet rebellion, a spark that would soon ignite a reckoning none of them could foresee. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787, now cruising at 35,000 feet, seemed to shrink under the weight of Isabella Vaughn's unrelenting hostility, her voice slicing through the hum of the engines like a blade as she leaned toward the flight attendant, her perfectly manicured nails jabbing the air. "Do you not understand English?" she snapped, her blue eyes blazing with entitlement. "This man," she gestured at Malcolm Carter without looking at him, "is in the wrong cabin, and I'm not spending my flight next to someone who looks like he crawled out of a thrift store." Malcolm, seated calmly in 2A, his worn corduroy jacket a silent rebuke to the cabin's extravagance, adjusted his glasses and met the flight attendant's nervous glance with a reassuring nod, as if to say he wouldn't escalate the storm brewing beside him. The attendant, a young woman named Emily, whose badge trembled slightly on her navy blazer, stammered, "Ma'am, I'll need to verify his boarding pass, but I'm sure there's no mistake." Isabella's laugh was sharp, almost theatrical, drawing the eyes of every passenger in the cabin, some with thinly veiled agreement, others with discomfort. "Verify? Look at him," she said, her voice dripping with racial venom, the word him carrying the weight of centuries-old prejudice. "He doesn't belong here, and you're wasting my time." Emily, caught between protocol and Isabella's wrath, turned to Malcolm, her voice apologetic. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, please?" Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate, and produced a crisp boarding pass, handing it over with a polite, "Of course." Emily scanned it, her brow furrowing as she confirmed his seat, then handed it back with a hesitant smile. "Everything's in order, sir. You're in the right place." Isabella's face contorted, her lips parting in disbelief before she exploded. "This is absurd. Are you telling me I have to sit here with him for 6 hours? I'll sue this airline. I know the CEO." Her threats echoed, and the silver-haired man across the aisle, who'd muttered earlier about slipping standards, nodded approvingly, his wife whispering something about entitlement these days. Malcolm, unfazed, folded the boarding pass and slipped it back into his pocket, his dark eyes scanning the cabin briefly before settling on Isabella. "If it's any consolation," and he said, his voice low and measured, "I've endured worse company and come out just fine." The remark, delivered with a hint of wry humor, landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling through the cabin, A woman in a silk scarf 2 rows back stifled a chuckle, while Isabella's cheeks flushed a deeper red. "You think you're clever?" she hissed, leaning so close her fur coat brushed his arm. "You're nothing but a fraud, and everyone here knows it. People like you always are." The racial undertone was unmistakable, her words a deliberate weapon, yet Malcolm's expression remained serene, almost as if he'd heard this script before. He tilted his head, studying her for a moment, then said, "It's a long flight, ma'am. Perhaps you'd find it more pleasant if you focused on something other than me." The suggestion, polite but pointed, seemed to inflame her further. Isabella turned to Emily, who hovered nearby, unsure whether to intervene again. "Get your supervisor," she demanded. "I'm not letting this go." Emily nodded, her face pale, and hurried toward the galley, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor. The cabin buzzed with whispers now, passengers exchanging glances, some openly staring at Malcolm, who opened his paperback again, his fingers tracing the familiar pages as if the chaos around him were mere background noise. A man in a polo shirt leaned toward his companion, muttering, "She's got a point. How'd he even afford this seat?" But others, like an older woman with a cane resting against her seat, watched Malcolm with quiet curiosity, noting the dignity in his posture, the way he seemed untouched by the venom aimed at him. When Emily returned with the supervisor, a middle-aged man named Richard with a practiced treating, the tension spiked. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," Richard began, addressing Isabella, "but I've checked the manifest, and this gentleman is indeed assigned to 2A. Isabella's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't care about your manifest. I'm Isabella Vaughn. My face is on every magazine from here to Paris. Do you know what I can do to your airline's reputation?" Richard's smile faltered, but he held his ground. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no error here. Perhaps we can offer you a complimentary amenity to make the flight more comfortable." The offer was a misstep. Isabella slammed her handbag onto the armrest, the thud echoing. "I don't want your cheap wine or blankets. I want him gone." She pointed at Malcolm, who finally looked up from his book, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the cabin for a moment. Then, as if addressing the entire plane, he added, "But I'd be happy to share a story about patience. If anyone's interested, it's helped me through tougher flights than this." The remark drew a few surprised murmurs, and the woman with the cane smiled faintly, her eyes bright with interest. Isabella, however, was livid. "A story?" she mocked, her voice rising again. "What are you, some kind of street preacher? Save it for the slums." The racial slur hung in the air, unspoken but palpable, and even Richard winced. He turned to Malcolm, his tone conciliatory. "Sir, I apologize for the disturbance. Can we get you anything?" Malcolm shook his head, his smile warm but resolute. "Just a little piece, if you can manage it." Richard nodded, then escorted Emily back to the galley, leaving Isabella fuming. She crossed her arms, her fur coat rustling, and glared at Malcolm, who returned to his book, his calm a fortress against her rage. The cabin settled into an uneasy stalemate, the hum of the engines filling the silence. But the battle was far from over, and Malcolm's quiet strength hinted at a power yet to be revealed. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787, now slicing through the night sky at 500 miles per hour, buzzed with an undercurrent of unease, the soft clink of champagne glasses and the rustle of magazines unable to mask the drama unfolding in Seat 2A, where Malcolm Carter, a middle-aged man of African descent, sat like a lighthouse weathering a storm. Isabella Vaughn, the white fashion model whose fame adorned Times Square billboards, had not relented, her fury a relentless tide as she leaned back in her seat, her fur coat spilling over the armrest, her voice now a venomous whisper meant for the entire cabin to hear. "This is what happens when they let just anyone into first class," she said, her words laced with racial contempt, her blue eyes darting to Malcolm as if daring him to respond. Malcolm, His worn corduroy jacket, a quiet defiance of the cabin's opulence, turned a page in his paperback, his dark eyes steady behind wire-rimmed glasses. But the weight of her words and the cabin's divided attention hung heavy. The passengers, no longer passive spectators, began to take sides, their whispers and glances forming a fractured jury. The silver-haired man in the tailored suit across the aisle, who'd earlier muttered about slipping standards, leaned toward his wife, his voice low but audible. "She's right, first class used to mean something. Now it's a free-for-all." His wife nodded, her diamond earrings glinting as she cast a disapproving look at Malcolm. But not everyone agreed. An older woman with a cane, seated a few rows back, her gray hair pinned neatly in a bun, watched Malcolm with a quiet intensity. Her lips pursed as if weighing his calm against Isabella's rage. Another passenger, a middle-aged one was in a navy blazer, muttered to his seatmate, "She's making a scene for no reason. He's just sitting there." The cabin's division mirrored a deeper fault line, one carved by prejudice and assumption, and Isabella, sensing her audience, pressed harder. "You're all thinking it," she said, her voice rising. "So why pretend? He doesn't belong here, and it's insulting to everyone who actually earned their place." The accusation, raw with racial undertones, drew a sharp inhale from the woman with the cane, who gripped her armrest, her knuckles whitening. Malcolm, still reading, closed his book with a soft thud, the sound cutting through the tension like a gavel. He turned to Isabella, his expression calm but piercing, and said, "You seem awfully certain about who belongs where. Care to hear a story about someone who was judged before he could speak?" The question, delivered with the cadence of a seasoned storyteller, caught the cabin off guard. Isabella scoffed, tossing her blonde hair. "Oh, please, spare us your sob story. Nobody cares." But the woman with the cane leaned forward, her voice frail but firm. "I'd like to hear it, sir." A few others nodded, their curiosity piqued, and Malcolm, with a slight smile, began. "Years ago," he said, his deep voice filling the cabin, "a young man boarded a train in Alabama, dressed in his Sunday best, hoping to make a good impression at a job interview in Chicago. He'd saved for months for that ticket, but when he took his seat in the dining car, a woman, much like you, ma'am," he nodded toward Isabella, "demanded he be removed, said his presence ruined her meal. The conductor checked his ticket, found it valid, but the woman wouldn't stop. She called him names I won't repeat, and soon others joined in, saying he didn't belong. That young man sat there silent, until an older gentleman, a stranger, spoke up and said, 'If he's paid his fare, he's earned his place.' Those words changed everything. The young man got to Chicago, got the job, and never forgot that lesson. Dignity isn't given, it's claimed." And the story, simple but profound, landed like a stone in the cabin's charged air. The woman with the cane nodded slowly, her eyes misty, while the man in the navy blazer clapped softly, murmuring, "Well said." But Isabella was unmoved, her laugh sharp and cruel. "Is that supposed to impress me? Some old train story? You're still sitting where you don't belong, and no fairy tale changes that." Her words, laced with racial venom, spurred the silver-haired man to chime in, his voice gruff. "She's got a point. Stories don't pay for first-class seats." The cabin teetered on the edge of chaos, passengers murmuring, some siding with Isabella's prejudice, others bristling at her cruelty. Malcolm, undeterred, opened his book again, but not before saying, "That young man learned something else. The loudest voices aren't always the truest." The remark, quiet but razor-sharp, silenced Isabella for a moment, her face twisting as she struggled for a retort. The flight attendant, Emily, reappeared, her nervous smile faltering as she sensed the cabin's volatility. "Can I get anyone anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. Isabella snapped, "How about a new seat, or are you all in on this scam?" Emily, flustered, offered a weak apology and retreated, leaving the cabin to its simmering divide. The woman with the cane caught Malcolm's eye and gave a small nod, a gesture of respect, while the silver-haired man muttered something about uppity types. Malcolm, his calm unshaken, turned his gaze to the window, where the stars glittered against the endless black, a reminder of the world beyond this cabin, a world where his true power waited, unseen but inevitable. The plane droned on, carrying its passengers toward a reckoning none could yet imagine, with Malcolm's quiet strength a beacon in the storm of prejudice. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787, cruising smoothly at 38,000 feet, was a pressure cooker of unspoken tensions, the soft glow of reading lights casting long shadows over the faces of passengers now fully invested in the drama unfolding in Seat 2A, where Malcolm Carter, a middle-aged man of African descent, sat with the unshakable calm of a man who'd faced worse storms than this. Isabella Vaughn, the white fashion model whose image adorned glossy magazines from New York to Milan, had settled into a simmering rage. Her fur coat draped carelessly over her seat, her 10,000 handbag a prop in her campaign to assert dominance. Her latest barb, delivered with a sneer, cut through the cabin's hum. You can play the saint all you want, but you're not fooling anyone. People like you don't end up in first class without a catch. The racial venom in her words was unmistakable, and the silver-haired man across the aisle, his tailored suit crisp despite the long flight, nodded in agreement, muttering to his wife, "There's always a story with these types." Malcolm, his worn corduroy jacket a badge of indifference to their judgments, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and set his paperback aside, his dark eyes meeting Isabella's with a quiet intensity that seemed to unnerve her. "You're very concerned with appearance, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word chosen with care. "But appearances can be deceiving. Take this, for example." He reached into his jacket pocket, his movements slow and unthreatening, and pulled out a small, weathered leather case, no larger than a wallet, its surface etched with a faint monogram that caught the light. He opened it briefly, revealing a glint of metal, a medal or insignia, too quick for most to discern, before snapping it shut and tucking it away. The gesture was subtle, almost casual, but it carried a weight that rippled through the cabin. The older woman with the cane, her gray hair pinned neatly, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as if she recognized something others missed. "What was that?" she asked, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Malcolm smiled faintly, his expression enigmatic. "Just a keepsake," he said. "From a time when I learned the value of proving myself to those who matter." Isabella's laugh was sharp, almost desperate, as she seized the moment to mock him. "A keepsake? What, some trinket you picked up at a flea market? You're pathetic." Her words, laced with racial contempt, drew chuckles from the silver-haired man and a few others, who saw Malcolm's gesture as a feeble attempt to claim status. The man in the navy blazer, who'd earlier shown sympathy, now looked skeptical, whispering to his seatmate, "Probably just a prop." But the woman with the cane wasn't convinced, her gaze lingering on Malcolm as if piecing together a puzzle. Isabella, emboldened by the cabin's divided reactions, leaned closer, her voice a venomous hiss. "You think flashing some cheap souvenir makes you somebody? You're still nobody, and you're ruining this flight for everyone who actually belongs here." The accusation, raw with prejudice, hung in the air, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Malcolm's response. He tilted his head, his smile unwavering, and said, "I've found that those who shout loudest about belonging are often the least secure in their place." The remark, delivered with the precision of a fencer's thrust, stung Isabella, her face flushing as she struggled for a retort. "You're lecturing me," she spat. "You with your ratty jacket and fake stories. You don't even deserve to be in coach, let alone here." The racial slur she implied, though unspoken, was clear, and the silver-haired man nodded again, his wife whispering, "She's not wrong." But Malcolm's calm remained a fortress, his hands folded in his lap, his fingers brushing the edge of that old leather watch, its understated elegance still unnoticed by the others. The flight attendant, Emily, hovered nearby, her nervous smile replaced by a look of exhaustion as she sensed the cabin's volatility. "Can I offer anyone a beverage?" she asked. Her voice strained. Isabella waved her off with a flick of her wrist, but the woman with the cane raised a hand. "I'll take a tea, dear. And maybe our friend here," she nodded toward Malcolm, "has another story worth hearing." The request drew a mix of reactions, eye rolls from Isabella's allies, curious glances from others. Malcolm chuckled softly, his deep voice warm but guarded. "I've told enough stories for now," he said. "But I'll say this, the truth has a way of revealing itself. No matter how many shout it down, the words, simple but laden with promise, landed like a challenge, and Isabella's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around her handbag. "Truth?" she mocked. "The truth is you're an embarrassment, and I'm done pretending otherwise." Her voice rose, drawing more stares, and the man in the tailored suit called out, "Why don't you just move him to the back? Problem solved." The suggestion, steeped in racial undertones, drew a sharp gasp from the woman with the cane, who muttered, "Shameful." Malcolm, however, remained unruffled, his gaze drifting to the window, where the moon hung like a silent witness over the endless clouds. The cabin settled into an uneasy truce, the hum of the engines a reminder of the hours still ahead. But Malcolm's subtle clue, that fleeting glimpse of a metal, had planted a seed of doubt, a crack in the wall of prejudice that surrounded him. The passengers, divided between scorn and curiosity, couldn't know that the man they dismissed held a power far greater than their judgments, a power that would soon turn their world upside down. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 787, now halfway through its 6-hour journey across the Atlantic, thrummed with a tension so thick it seemed to press against the curved walls, the soft clatter of cutlery and the drone of engines no match for the storm brewing in Seat 2A, where Malcolm Carter, a middle-aged man of African descent, sat with a composure that seemed to mock the chaos around him. Isabella Vaughn, the white fashion model whose face was plastered across Vogue and Vanity Fair, had exhausted her repertoire of insults, but not her venom, her fur coat slung over her seat like a battle flag, her $10,000 handbag a silent testament to her self-proclaimed superiority. Her latest attack, delivered with a sneer that could curdle cream, sliced through the cabin's uneasy quiet. "You're a nobody playing dress-up, and it is pathetic. Why don't you just admit you don't belong here and save us all the trouble?" The racial undertone, sharp as a blade, drew nods from the silver-haired man across the aisle, his tailored suit a badge of his own privilege, while his wife whispered, "It's embarrassing, really." But Malcolm, his worn corduroy jacket a quiet rebellion against their judgments, set his paperback down with a deliberate slowness, his dark eyes locking onto Isabella's with an intensity that made her flinch. Though she'd never admit it, the cabin, a jury of strangers, leaned in, sensing a shift, their whispers fading as Malcolm's deep voice, steady and resonant, filled the space. "You've spent this entire flight telling me who I am," he said, each word measured. "So allow me to clarify. My name is Malcolm Carter, and I'm the founder of Carter Global Initiatives, a firm that advises governments and corporations on matters of international policy. I've dined with presidents, negotiated peace in war zones, and yes, I paid for this seat with my own money." The revelation landed like a thunderclap, its weight reverberating through the cabin. But before anyone could process it, Isabella burst into laughter, a high, mocking sound that shattered the moment. "You, a global mogul?" she scoffed, tossing her blonde hair. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all year. What's next? You're secretly the king of Africa?" Her sarcasm, dripping with racial contempt, sparked chuckles from the silver-haired man and several others, their disbelief a wall of prejudice too thick for Malcolm's words to penetrate. The man in the navy blazer, who'd shown flickers of sympathy earlier, shook his head, muttering, He's got some imagination. Even the flight attendant, Emily, hovering nearby with a tray of drinks, looked skeptical, her nervous smile betraying her doubt. Only the older woman with the cane, her gray hair pinned neatly, remained silent, her eyes fixed on Malcolm with a glimmer of recognition, as if she'd seen his name in a headline years ago. Isabella, emboldened by the cabin's reaction, leaned closer, her voice a venomous whisper. You're a liar, and a bad one. People like you don't run companies or meet presidents. You're just a con artist in a cheap jacket, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The threat, raw with racial venom, hung in the air, and the silver-haired man called out, someone should check his ID, probably stolen. The suggestion, steeped in bigotry, drew murmurs of agreement from some, while others shifted uncomfortably, torn between doubt and unease. Malcolm, however, didn't flinch, his hands folded in his lap, his old leather watch catching the cabin's soft light, a detail still unnoticed by those too blinded by prejudice to see. You're entitled to your opinions, he said, his voice calm but carrying a new edge. But the truth doesn't bend to laughter or lies. I've spent my life proving my worth, and I don't need your validation to know it. On the words, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who'd faced down worse than a spoiled model, silenced Isabella for a moment, her face twisting as she grappled for a retort. Proving your worth? She spat, recovering her bravado. You've proven nothing except how out of place you are. Look at you, nobody believes your little fantasy. And the cabin erupted in whispers, passengers exchanging glances, some smirking, others frowning. The divide between prejudice and curiosity sharper than ever. The woman with the cane spoke up, her voice frail but clear. I believe him, she said, drawing startled looks. I've heard of Carter Global. They brokered that trade deal with Japan a few years back. Her words, a lifeline in the sea of doubt, were quickly drowned out by Isabella's laughter. Oh, please, you're as delusional as he is. Kenya, she said, waving a dismissive hand. The silver-haired man chimed in. She's right, this is getting absurd. He's just digging a deeper hole. Malcolm, undeterred, leaned back into the seat, the leather creaking softly, and offered a faint smile, one that hinted at a confidence unshaken by their scorn. Time has a way of sorting things out, he said, his tone almost prophetic. And we've got a few hours left on this flight. The cryptic remark, laced with promise, sent a shiver through the cabin, though most dismissed it as bravado. Isabella crossed her arms, her fur coat rustling, and muttered, You'll be sorry when we land. Emily, still lingering, offered Malcolm a glass of water, which he accepted with a warm, Thank you, ma'am. The small act of kindness seemed to infuriate Isabella further, her eyes narrowing as she watched him sip calmly, as if he were savoring the moment rather than enduring it. The cabin settled into a restless quiet, the hum of the engines a backdrop to the passengers' divided thoughts, some clinging to their prejudice, others wrestling with doubt, and a few, like the woman with the cane, sensing that Malcolm's revelation was no lie. Outside, the night sky stretched endless, a canvas of stars bearing witness to a truth that would soon upend the cabin's fragile hierarchy, with Malcolm's quiet power a ticking clock counting down to a reckoning. The Boeing 787 descended through the pre-dawn haze, its landing gear humming as it touched down on the tarmac at Los Angeles International Airport. The first-class cabin bathed in the pale glow of early morning, but the air inside was electric with unresolved tension. The drama in Seat 2A now poised for a reckoning that none could have predicted. Malcolm Carter, the middle-aged man of African descent whose worn corduroy jacket had been a lightning rod for scorn, sat calmly, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the cabin's soft lights, his old leather watch a quiet testament to a life far grander than his appearance suggested. Isabella Vaughn, the white fashion model whose fame was her armor, sat rigid beside him, her fur coat bundled in her lap, her $10,000 handbag clutched like a shield, her earlier laughter replaced by a simmering unease, though she'd never admit it. The cabin, a microcosm of divided hearts, buzzed with anticipation as the plane taxied to the gate, passengers craning their necks to glimpse the resolution of a conflict that had consumed the 6-hour flight. Isabella's final jab, delivered as the seatbelt sign chimed off, was a desperate attempt to reclaim control. You can spin your stories all you want, but you're still nobody, and this flight proves it. Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts. The racial venom, though softer now, was unmistakable, and the silver-haired man across the aisle, his tailored suit slightly wrinkled, nodded, muttering, "She's right, talk is cheap." But Malcolm, his dark eyes steady, offered only a faint smile, his voice low and cryptic. "Fantasies end, ma'am, but reality has a way of sticking around." The words, laced with quiet certainty, sent a ripple through the cabin, and the older woman with the cane, her gray hair pinned neatly, caught Malcolm's eye, her nod a silent affirmation of her belief in him. As the plane docked at the gate, the cabin stirred, passengers gathering their belongings, but all eyes remained on Malcolm and Isabella, the air thick with expectation. The door opened, and a murmur swept through the cabin as a group of sharply dressed figures appeared at the entrance, their presence commanding immediate attention. Leading them was a tall man in a charcoal suit, his earpiece and clip movements marking him as private security, followed by two others in tailored blazers, one carrying a leather briefcase embossed with a discreet logo that the woman with the cane recognized instantly, Carter Global Initiatives. "Mr. Carter," the security lead said, his voice cutting through the cabin's hum, "we're here to escort you to your meeting with the governor. The car is ready." The words landed like a bombshell, silencing the cabin, and every head turned to Malcolm, who rose smoothly from his seat, his corduroy jacket suddenly seeming less out of place, his calm dignity a stark contrast to the chaos he'd endured. Isabella's face drained of color, her lips parting in disbelief, her handbag slipping to the floor with a soft thud. The silver-haired man froze, his wife's diamond earrings glinting as she whispered, "That's him?" The man in the navy blazer, who doubted Malcolm's claims, stared wide-eyed, while the woman with the cane smiled, her faith vindicated. Malcolm adjusted his glasses, his expression serene, and turned to Isabella, his voice gentle but firm. "I told you the truth would sort itself out. I hope you find some peace with that." The words, devoid of malice, cut deeper than any retort, and Isabella recoiled, her bravado crumbling under the weight of her misjudgment. The flight attendant, Emily, stood at the cabin's edge, her nervous smile replaced by awe as she watched Malcolm gather his small carry-on, a simple canvas bag that now seemed to carry the weight of his authority. The security lead stepped forward, offering to take the bag, but Malcolm declined with a polite, "I've got it, thank you." The gesture, humble yet commanding, drew murmurs from the passengers, some now whispering about Carter Global's role in global diplomacy, others recalling headlines about Malcolm's work with the United Nations. Isabella, her face a mask of shock, scrambled to her feet, her fur coat slipping as she fumbled for her phone, perhaps to check Malcolm's claims or to salvage her dignity. "This can't be real," she muttered, her voice trembling. But the reality was undeniable as the entourage flanked Malcolm, their polished shoes clicking against the jet bridge as they escorted him toward the terminal. The silver-haired man, his earlier smugness gone, avoided Malcolm's gaze, while his wife stared at her lap, her cheeks flushed with shame. The man in the navy blazer offered a hesitant nod, a silent apology, but Malcolm, focused on the path ahead, didn't notice. The woman with the cane, her eyes bright, called out softly, "Well done, Mr. Carter," and he turned, offering her a warm smile that spoke of shared understanding. As Malcolm disappeared into the terminal, the cabin erupted in hushed chaos, passengers exchanging stunned glances, some grappling with their prejudice, others marveling at the man they'd underestimated. Isabella, now alone in her seat, her fame suddenly irrelevant, stared at the empty space where Malcolm had been, her hands trembling as she realized the consequences of her actions might follow her beyond this flight. The hum of the airport filtered into the cabin, a reminder of the world waiting outside, where Malcolm's power would soon reshape the narrative of this journey, leaving those who judged him to confront the truth they'd so eagerly dismissed. The terminal at Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with the controlled chaos of morning arrivals, its glass walls reflecting the golden light of a California sunrise. But for the passengers of the Boeing 787's first-class cabin, the world had narrowed to the aftermath of a revelation that had shattered their assumptions, leaving them to grapple with the truth about Malcolm Carter, the man they'd scorned for 6 hours. Malcolm, the middle-aged man of African descent, whose worn corduroy jacket had been a canvas for their prejudice, walked with measured steps down the jet bridge, flanked by his entourage, a security lead in a charcoal suit, 2 aides in tailored blazers, and a driver waiting at the gate with a placard reading, "Carter Global Initiatives." His wire-rimmed glasses glinted under the terminal's fluorescent lights, his old leather watch a subtle marker of a life built on quiet power, and his calm demeanor, unshaken by the flight's ordeal, now carried an air of inevitability, as if he'd always known this moment would come. Behind him, the cabin's passengers trailed, their footsteps hesitant, their faces a gallery of shock, shame, and defiance. Isabella Vaughn, the white fashion model whose fame had fueled her arrogance, clutched her $10,000 handbag, her fur coat trailing like a fallen banner, her earlier bravado replaced by a pallor that betrayed her fear of consequences. The silver-haired man in the tailored suit, who'd backed Isabella's venom, walked with his wife, their heads bowed, avoiding the gazes of others, while the woman with the cane, her gray hair pinned neatly, moved slowly but with a quiet triumph. Her faith in Malcolm vindicated, the man in the navy blazer, who'd wavered between doubt and sympathy, lingered at the back, his expression one of regret. As Malcolm reached the gate, a sleek black SUV idled outside, its tinted windows a promise of the power he wielded. But he paused, turning to his security lead with a low, deliberate instruction that drew curious glances from the passengers spilling into the terminal. "Make a note," he said, his deep voice carrying just far enough. "I'd like a report on the conduct of this flight, particularly the handling of passenger complaints." The security lead nodded, jotting something on a tablet, and the implication landed like a stone in the crowd. Malcolm wasn't just leaving, he was acting. Isabella, overhearing, froze, her manicured nails digging into her handbag, her mind racing to the threats she'd hurled, the racial slurs she'd implied, and the social media posts she'd drafted during the flight, now potentially a liability. The flight attendant, Emily, stood nearby, her nervous smile gone, her eyes wide as she realized her failure to intervene might be scrutinized. The silver-haired man, catching Malcolm's words, muttered to his wife, "He's bluffing." But his voice lacked conviction, and she shushed him, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Malcolm, however, didn't linger on their discomfort. He turned to the woman with the cane, who'd reached the gate, and offered a warm, "Thank you for your kindness, ma'am." "It meant more than you know." She smiled, her eyes misty, and replied, "Good. You remind me of my brother. He never let the world's noise dim his light." The exchange, brief but heartfelt, drew a lump to the throats of those nearby, a reminder of the humanity Malcolm had embodied despite the cabin's cruelty. As he moved toward the SUV, a young woman in a sharp blazer, one of his aides, stepped forward, her voice low but clear. "Sir, we've had a call from Miss Vaughn's agency. They're concerned about a potential PR issue and want to discuss a partnership." The words, spoken just loud enough for Isabella to hear, were a masterstroke of subtlety, and Malcolm's response was equally measured. "Tell them I'm not interested in partnering with those who judge before they understand," he said, his tone calm but final, a rejection that carried the weight of justice without the need for fanfare. Isabella's face crumpled, her fame suddenly a fragile shield against the reality of Malcolm's influence, and she stumbled slightly, her fur coat catching on her heel as she realized her career might pay the price for her prejudice. The silver-haired man, witnessing the exchange, turned away, his earlier smugness replaced by a dawning awareness of his own complicity. The man in the navy blazer, now openly remorseful, approached Malcolm hesitantly, his voice low. "Sir, I misjudged you." "I'm sorry." Malcolm paused, his dark eyes assessing the man with a kindness that disarmed him. "We all make mistakes," he said, "but it's what we do after that matters." The words, simple but profound, left the man nodding, his shoulders sagging with relief and resolve. As Malcolm reached the SUV, the driver opened the door, revealing a leather interior that spoke of quiet wealth. But before stepping inside, he turned to the crowd one last time, his gaze sweeping over the passengers who judged him. "Prejudice is a heavy burden," he said, his voice steady, "and it's never too late to set it down." The statement, delivered with the authority of someone who'd spent decades dismantling barriers, silenced the terminal, and even Isabella, now surrounded by curious onlookers, looked away, her hands trembling. Malcolm stepped into the SUV, the door closing with a soft thud, and as the vehicle pulled away, the passengers were left in a wake of introspection, their whispers a mix of awe and regret. The woman with the cane watched him go, her smile a beacon of hope, while Isabella, alone in the crowd, faced the weight of a truth she could no longer deny, her fame no match for the justice Malcolm had so elegantly delivered. The Los Angeles International Airport terminal, awash in the golden glow of a California sunrise, pulsed with the rhythm of travelers and their stories. But for the passengers of the Boeing 787's first-class cabin, the morning held a singular weight, a reckoning born from the 6-hour flight that had exposed their prejudices and upended their assumptions about Malcolm Carter, the man of African descent whose quiet dignity had reshaped their world. Malcolm, his worn corduroy jacket now a symbol of resilience rather than inadequacy, had stepped into the sleek black SUV, its tinted windows closing him off from the crowd, but his presence lingered like a beacon in the terminal, where passengers from the flight stood scattered, their faces a tapestry of reflection, regret, and for some, stubborn defiance. Isabella Vaughn, the white fashion model whose fame had been her sword and shield, stood alone near the gate, her $10,000 handbag dangling limply, her fur coat crumpled in her arms, her once impenetrable confidence fractured by the reality of Malcolm's power and the consequences now looming over her career. The silver-haired man in the tailored suit, who'd fueled Isabella's venom with his own prejudice, shuffled toward a coffee kiosk with his wife, their heads bowed, their earlier smugness replaced by a silence that spoke of shame. The man in the navy blazer, who'd offered Malcolm a belated apology, lingered near the gate, his eyes fixed on the spot where the SUV had disappeared, his expression one of quiet resolve to be better. The older woman with the cane, her gray hair pinned neatly, stood apart, her smile serene as she clutched a small notebook, perhaps jotting down the lesson Malcolm had embodied, that dignity, not wealth or fame, defines a person's worth. The terminal's hum, announcements, footsteps, the clatter of luggage, faded into the background as the passengers grappled with the aftermath of Malcolm's departure. His final words echoing in their minds, "Prejudice is a heavy burden, and it's never too late to set it down." For some, those words were a lifeline, a call to change. For others, like Isabella, they were a mirror, reflecting a truth too painful to face. Isabella, her phone now silent, its screen dark after frantic calls to her agent, sank onto a bench, her eyes glassy as she replayed the flight, her taunts, her racial slurs, her blind certainty that Malcolm was beneath her. The news of Malcolm's rejection of her agency's partnership, a decision that could blacklist her from elite circles, had spread through whispers in the terminal, and passers-by glanced at her with curiosity, unaware of the story but sensing her fall. She'd built her life on appearances, but Malcolm's truth had stripped that away, leaving her to confront the cost of her prejudice, not just in lost opportunities, but in the erosion of her own humanity. The silver-haired man, sipping his coffee, avoided eye contact with the other passengers. His wife's hand on his arm, a quiet plea to move on. But his muttered, he didn't have to make a scene. Betrayed a refusal to fully acknowledge his error, a clinging to the comfort of old biases. Yet others were changed. The man in the navy blazer, inspired by Malcolm's grace, vowed to challenge prejudice in his own circles, starting with a conversation he'd long avoided with his colleagues. The woman with the cane, her faith in Malcolm rewarded, wrote in her notebook a single line: "True power is in how you carry your heart, not your name." The flight attendant, Emily, who'd faltered under Isabella's demands, stood at the gate, her shift over, her eyes distant as she resolved to speak up next time, to be the ally Malcolm had needed but never asked for. The story of the flight, already rippling beyond the terminal, would live on in these small acts of change, in the hearts of those who'd witnessed Malcolm's triumph over a cabin steeped in bigotry. As the SUV carried Malcolm through the streets of Los Angeles, toward a meeting with the governor to discuss global trade policies, he gazed out the window, the city's skyline a testament to human ambition and its flaws. He didn't revel in the passengers' humiliation. His justice had been delivered not to destroy, but to awaken, to offer a chance for redemption. His life, built on decades of navigating prejudice, from boardrooms to war zones, had taught him that true victory lay in rising above, in proving worth through action, not vengeance. The passengers, now dispersing into their lives, carried fragments of that lesson, some to nurture, others to bury. Isabella, still on her bench, felt the weight of her choices, her fame a hollow echo as she faced a future shadowed by her own words. The terminal, like the world beyond, moved on, but the story of Malcolm Carter and the flight that changed a cabin's soul would endure, a quiet parable of humility, dignity, and the enduring power of truth to reshape even the hardest hearts. Malcolm, a black titan, faced prejudice on a flight, only to reveal his global influence, humbling his critics. Thank you for joining this journey. Like, share, and subscribe to catch every gripping tale. Hit the bell so you never miss our latest videos. Your support keeps these stories alive. See you next time.